Hi, it's Victoria Field, co-host of Metabolic Health Summit 2020. Thank you so much for joining me today. We have such a special guest in the room. His name is Dr. John Newman, and he is our keynote speaker for our 2020 conference. He's also an assistant professor at the Buck Institute for Research on Aging, as well as a geriatrician at UC San Francisco and San Francisco VA. And his research at Buck Institute specifically focuses on the molecular details of diet and fasting and how they regulate genes and pathways that in turn control aging, something that affects all of us. He's got a specific interest, though, in the ketone body beta-hydroxybutyrate and its molecular signaling activities. So I'm so thrilled to introduce to you today Dr. John Newman.
Hi, Victoria, and hi, everyone out there. Pleasure to be here.
I'm so excited to dive into this with you today. So let's kind of bring it back a little bit and talk about how this all started for you with this interest in ketones and aging specifically.
Yeah, and so Victoria, so I come at this from an aging angle, which is going to be maybe a little bit different from some folks in your audience. And it kind of all starts with this long history we know of how nutrition, metabolism, and aging are very closely linked. This is one of well, first of all, some of your readers may be surprised to hear that aging is a scientific discipline. You can study the molecular mechanisms of why and how we age. And we can learn about the genes that regulate and modulate how we age, and even how to intervene on the mechanisms of aging. And even that interventions that target mechanisms of aging are in clinical trials right now. So aging is a really exciting field to be in, and one of the pillars of aging biology is how it's so closely intertwined with nutrition and metabolism. And that's where I come. That's how I got introduced to ketone bodies as these really interesting molecules that just happen to be produced by our own body. When we fast, if we eat less, if we exercise, if we, all the buzzwords out there about dietary restriction and calorie restriction, intermittent fasting, and time-restricted feeding. These are all things that are increasingly studied for their effects on aging mechanisms, and ketone bodies are made during most of them.
Right.
So I got into this area just being curious about the idea of, are ketone bodies just there because we need them to help us survive when we're fasting? Or are they actually part of the biology? Are they part of why fasting has effects on our cells and effects on our organs and effects on mechanisms of aging? And of course, as I'll tell all you folks out there, and as I'll talk about during the summit, I think that ketone bodies are one of the molecular mechanisms that sort of translates the health benefits of fasting and dietary restriction and all these, and exercise and all these things that we study.
Right.
And I'm particularly focused on how ketone bodies do that themselves, how they manipulate enzymes and pathways and bind to things and act in many ways like drugs in our own bodies
Right.
to affect mechanisms of aging and health.
It's pretty incredible work that you're doing. Where do you see this in terms of where you want to go in the future? I know when it comes to the care and sort of when it comes to the care of adult patients, like you see this specifically, and you have a specific mission when it comes to this in your research. Where do you see this going for you?
Yeah, I'm really grounded in being a geriatrician. A geriatrician is just part of my identity and who I am. So geriatricians are doctors, often internal medicine doctors and sometimes family practice doctors who specialize in the unique, complex problems of older adults. And I've just found this to be an incredibly important and difficult and challenging and satisfying area of medicine. And one of the things that is a little challenging about it uh, is that aging is really complicated biologically, and so the problems that affect older adults are often equally complicated. It's never just one thing.
Right.
It's always lots of things coming together to cause a big problem, like a fall and a hip
Right.
fracture, or like I spend most of my time clinically working in the hospital, trying to keep older adults safe while they're in the hospital, and prevent problems that sometimes we as doctors can contribute to in the hospital. So keep older folks safe and as well as possible while they're healing from whatever it is that landed them in the hospital in the first place. And some of these problems, like delirium and acute sudden confusion that can happen to older folks in the hospital. Many of you listeners may have seen an older relative who is affected by delirium. These are complicated biological problems. It's not the sort of thing that, it's not like treating an infection with an antibiotic. We need
Right.
to understand everything about aging in an individual that makes them susceptible to these problems and figure out what's causing a problem like the acute confusion in the brain of delirium, and then figure out better ways to treat it.
Right.
Um, and I hope that that mechanisms of aging and things like ketone bodies that can modulate mechanisms of aging, that can help to support energy functions that may be declining with age, can help to affect cellular pathways and inflammation that may be changing with age. That these may be unique ways to create new therapies to help with these complex problems of older adults. That's why I'm in this. That's why I'm in this field. I
Right.
want better tools, new tools, to help to prevent delirium and treat frailty and help older folks, which is all of us,
Yeah.
stay healthy and independent as long as we can.
Absolutely. I mean, it affects all of us. It's not just, older adults. Is something we'll all go through as we age. So this is important to
Hmm.
everybody. And if we can utilize things like diet and fasting to help, maybe push off some of the things that we just see as, oh, it's part of old age. But, this could be a pretty powerful thing. And as I'm sure I know I'm preaching to the choir about, it's why you're so excited about it, which is really great. And, if you could talk a little bit about some of your specific research with ketone bodies and what, an area of interest you might find particularly fascinating in what you've done.
Yeah. So when I first started out in the science of aging with my mentor Eric Verdon, who also works here at the Buck Institute, and we were looking at ketone bodies, we got into ketone bodies uh, because we found that it seemed like, and I know this isn't really the case, and but it seemed like ketone bodies were mostly thought of as energy. Something that your body makes to burn fat, and your cells use them to make energy to do whatever cells need to do. Um, but we found this really interesting drug-like effect of beta-hydroxybutyrate specifically, that it inhibits a really important class of enzymes in all of our cells that control gene expression. These are called histone deacetylases. And drugs that inhibit histone deacetylases are very powerful drugs, and there are even some that are in clinical use for certain kinds of cancers, for example. So this is really powerful biology that beta hydroxybutyrate is manipulating in all of our cells. Every time we fast, every time we exercise and make ketone bodies. So it really got our imaginations going, me and Eric, about why does beta hydroxybutyrate have this really powerful drug-like effect on gene expression? What does it mean biologically? What does that mean for the effects of ketone bodies on health? And what else do ketone bodies do that we don't know about yet?
Right. So many things already.
So my lab now is focusing on studying all these different things that beta hydroxybutyrate might do that affect the aging brain. So part of that is supporting energy in the aging brain, of course, but also part of that is how do ketone bodies and beta hydroxybutyrate affect gene expression through inhibiting deacetylases or through other means like beta hydroxybutyrate. We now know through the work of a great scientist at the University of Chicago can bind directly to the proteins that DNA wraps around. So there's a bunch of ways in which beta hydroxybutyrate affects our gene expression. And then there's some great work from Deep Dixit at Yale, who showed how beta hydroxybutyrate can affect inflammation and affect how our immune cells decide whether to become activated and inflamed or not. All these things might be relevant to the aging brain, not just how does our memory change as we get older, but also how does the aging in our brain affect our susceptibility to something like Alzheimer's disease?
Right. Yeah.
Alzheimer's disease mostly doesn't happen in young people. It's a problem of the aging brain. It happens in the context of the aging brain, and maybe we can understand what it is about the aging brain that makes it susceptible to Alzheimer's disease, and how ketone bodies, through a bunch of these different effects, might change that. So my lab is trying to really understand this in a very detailed way, by using not just by using various models in the laboratory, cells and animals, and using different diets, but also using a variety of chemicals, by which we can kind of pick out just this function of ketone bodies or just that function of ketone bodies, and really try to learn, exactly how it is that ketone bodies are having these effects on the aging brain. And the hope is that if we really understand at a deep level, what exactly is it that beta-hydroxybutyrate is doing to, for example, help affect Alzheimer's risk, then we can turn that into therapies. We can hopefully create very targeted therapies, that can be targeted to just the people that need them, and just in the context, just in the way that they need it, and capture some of that benefit of ketone bodies.
That's pretty incredible. One thing I'm so curious of, as you've worked on this for some time now, how has this changed your life personally? Because we're talking about things, something, I know this is a big loaded question, but I'm so curious, if you don't mind sharing, how
Yeah.
it's affected your life personally in terms of diet and fasting, if at all. I mean, there's obviously still much to learn, right, in this ever expanding area of aging. But what would you say to that?
Well, this is one of the fun things about this field, right? We talk about, detailed molecular mechanisms and genes and molecules and all that, but we're also talking about things that are a normal part of our everyday life.
Right.
I know I probably sound like, in that last bit, like, I want to find the keto mimetic drug to target just this thing, and I think that's important to go that way
Absolutely.
to make sure that we can, help the most people who need it. Uh, but you can manipulate this powerful biology yourself, uh, by fasting for a day,
Right.
or trying a ketogenic diet. Um, so it's a really fun area of science, because it's relevant to all of our everyday lives, and though we might, uh, you know kind of get more medical about how to apply it in a specific disease context, it's also interesting to think about how, everyone, how it might change the way all of us think about how we live our everyday lives, and if this should be a part of that.
Yeah.
And it has kind of changed a little bit the way that I think about the way I live my everyday life. Um, and it's definitely learning more about ketone biology. First of all, kind of helped change my relationship to fats.
I'm sure.
It is still common. It's still kind of common wisdom that, like, fats are the enemy and fats are bad for you, and um, but it's definitely kind of opened my horizons a little bit in thinking about, well, maybe in the right context, fats actually aren't bad for you, and maybe, it's actually part of a normal, healthy physiology to
Right.
be burning fats from time to time. Um, and I guess I've incorporated that a little bit into my daily life and my own food choices. I definitely eat more avocados and
That's awesome.
olive oil these days. And I should confess, because I'm sure your readers will ask, I've never really tried a ketogenic diet,
Okay.
in part because I really like sweets.
Yeah. Uh,
Although my
there's
research
keto chocolate,
shows that
right?
exactly, that's true, that's true.
Yeah.
Although I had one of the really fun bits of some of the laboratory mouse experiments I did was showing that necessarily need eating a ketogenic diet all the time, to get health effects from that.
Yeah.
So
Right.
maybe
So
there's hope for my cake.
cycling
I do
through in
fast
periods.
though.
Oh, that's
Exactly,
great. I mean,
exactly.
there's so many
So
different ways you can induce, obviously, a state of ketosis, right? Fasting is a pretty
mhm.
powerful thing. So that's great. I mean, it's something that if you don't maybe necessarily want to follow a strict ketogenic diet, you could implement periods of fasting and maybe get some of the same benefit, which is really
Yeah.
interesting. So,
Uh,
yeah.
and this is also a fun thing that's kind of come from the science. So many people study the science of how kind of the fasting metabolism, as I'll
Mm,
call it, affects aging. And it's incredibly powerful, and not just ketone bodies, but talking about, targeted rapamycin, TOR, and
right.
autophagy, and AMPK, and and these things are leading towards drug development and clinical trials. But it's the fasting metabolism.
Yeah.
Um, but you can do that in all sorts of different ways.
Right.
And you can do experiments in the laboratory to show that, yeah, it sort of doesn't matter how you do it. Fasting for shorter or longer, more or less strict, maybe a ketogenic diet, all these different daily caloric restriction, all these are all different kind of patterns of eating that all get at the same kind of underlying core
Right.
of putting our bodies in more of a fasting metabolic state.
Right.
And that pretty clearly has health benefits in the laboratory, and increasingly starting to generate clinical data that this has health benefits for people too in different contexts.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. It's really interesting how the ketogenic too, a diet has sort of evolved in terms of its medical application. I mean,
Yeah.
what they used to think that you would have to follow for seizure control, for instance, over
Hmm.
time has changed to where, you might be able to follow a modified ketogenic diet and still get some of the same effects. So it's pretty interesting how it's evolved over time. What areas are you going to be specifically topic or cover on in terms of topics at Metabolic Health Summit 2020? I know aging is such a vast area, but it affects all of us, and we're so excited for you to kind of dive into this. But if you could explain a little bit about where you're going to go with it.
Yeah, well, I'm going to try to cover two broad themes. So one is the aging angle. What is the relationship between ketone bodies and aging biology and mechanisms of aging? And I'll share with our listeners and our viewers about some of the work that's been done in the laboratory now, me and other labs all around the country, that look at the effects of ketogenic diet and ketone bodies on aging, on longevity, on age-related conditions and diseases, on health span, um, and more specifically on the aging brain. And then why is that? And not just a little bit about the framing of ketone bodies as one of these mechanisms of the fasting metabolism, but also getting into the weeds a little bit on this whole idea of ketone bodies as signaling molecules. And so I'll give everyone hopefully a nice understandable overview of kind of the state of the art of what we know so far about ketone bodies, beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate, as signaling molecules, as drug-like molecules, that have direct effects on enzymes and proteins and pathways, and what that means for aging and longevity and health span, and what it means for health and disease too.
Right. Absolutely. Well, we could not be looking forward more to your presentation coming up at Metabolic Health Summit. It's such an important topic, and you're really on the cutting edge when it comes to research on aging specifically. And I'm very much looking forward to it myself, because this is a topic that affects all of us. So thank you for participating in the conference coming up here in January.
Oh, you're too kind. I'm happy to play a small role, just as I play a very small role in this field. And in many ways, I'm a newcomer to this field, and I'm looking forward to learning so much from everyone else at the meeting about elements of ketogenic diet and ketone bodies that I don't know about yet. But I'll tell your listeners, from the perspective of a physician scientist, it's a really exciting time, I think, to be in the area of the science of ketone bodies and ketogenic diets. Clinical trials are just blooming,
Yeah.
I think, because we're having a better and better idea of what sorts of clinical contexts ketone bodies and ketogenic diets will be helpful in. As I'm sure some folks at the meeting will talk about, we're developing more and more tools for
Right.
how to translate these things into different kinds of interventions. Ketogenic diets and fasting, and this whole idea of exogenous ketones, which is really exciting. And now that we're learning more and more about the biology, and the biology of ketone bodies is just exploding in the last 10 years. And that really helps inform how we use them clinically.
Right.
What are the molecular effects we're looking for? What are the biomarkers we're going to use? How are we going to know if things are working? And this is all feeding back on itself. And I think
Yeah.
really making this an incredible time for the science of ketone bodies.
Absolutely. And that's why we're so passionate about bringing all of these people together, these great minds, because the collaboration that happens and what
Yeah.
we sort of all learn from each other and where this is headed is key on that sort of working together mentality. And so we couldn't be more excited to have you as part of that, because this is such a big area of all of our lives and it's so important. So thank you for your important work. And like you sort of mentioned, and the interesting part of this is just really being able to take some of this research and applying it in the real world, which is sort of,
Hmm.
essentially what you're setting us up to be able to do. And that's what the goal is of Metabolic Health Summit, to really bridge that gap between this incredible research that's happening on the front lines and the real world. So could not be more excited. If you would like to attend Metabolic Health Summit, you're watching this, visit metabolichealthsummit.com. You can learn more about Dr. John Newman. There is a link on our website on his photo, and definitely check out his important work. Dr. Newman, thank you so much for joining me today and going through what we're going to be covering in 2020.
My pleasure. Looking forward to the summit.
All right. Thank you guys for watching.
Bye, everyone.